Is Star Wars The Force Unleashed worse than you remember? As a kid, I remember the game being a lot of fun, but after playing this game multiple times over the years, I can confidently say while there is still some fun to be had, there's a lot of things I dislike. Created within the extended universe of one of the biggest franchises ever, it's hard not to use it as a guideline of how I judge this game. So I'm going to talk about The Force Unleashed not only as a standalone game, but how it pertains to the overall franchise. What did the game do that I liked? What did it do that I didn't like? And how does it affect the legacy of The Force Unleashed and how I view the game all these years later? When I look at games that I played growing up, I tend to look at them with rose-tinted glasses, or better known as nostalgia. I'm sure we all have that personal experience with this in one way or another. Remembering something in a positive light is not always an accurate representation of what it was. When I look at The Force Unleashed, that's exactly how I feel. From a very quick look, playing as a secret apprentice of Vader and exploring new parts of the Star Wars universe seems like a very promising concept. And honestly, it could have been, but in execution, there's some problems that I think caused the game to get worse the more I played it. I spoke earlier on how the game needs to be able to fit into the Star Wars universe as a whole. And you might be asking why that's important if it's just a different interpretation of a part of a Star Wars timeline. Well, at the time of release in 2008, the game was considered canon. It wasn't considered retconned until 2014, so at that point the game was no longer canon. When I look at the game, I look at it through the idea that it was created with the plan of it being canon because that's how it was developed. So I want to talk about a few of the problems I have with the plot of The Force Unleashed compared to what I remembered the first time I played it. When I went back to play the story and take a deeper dive into the characters, I realized how flat Galen Marek really is. I remember him as this really strong, cool protagonist, but in all honesty, he comes off as the Gary Stu prototype, which, if you don't know what the Gary Stu is, basically it's when you have no weaknesses, but not because we get to see that build up over like training, but it's just because we're told, okay, this character is really strong. It's always more interesting to me when a character must earn everything they're given. They're not just necessarily born with it. So it becomes very hard to connect with Galen throughout the course of the game. Instead of feeling myself immersed in the decisions, I'm more of a bystander watching this really powerful character do some really cool things. And that's not what makes characters interesting to me. Think about why we like Vader. It's not because of his power, although that is really cool. It's the tragic backstory that almost makes you root for him. Seeing that change from Anakin to Vader makes you feel emotion towards him. That's the type of story I would have liked to explore on a deeper level with Galen's journey. Especially when we look back at the idea of Vader having that second apprentice or almost a chance at redemption after everything that happened with Ahsoka. It could have been a really unique angle to see the differences and parallels of how Vader treated Galen versus how Anakin treated Ahsoka. Unfortunately to me, Galen comes off as a creator's pet. Outside of his power levels, which I will talk about more later, I find it hard to find anything substantial about his character traits that I think hold up well over time. That's the opposite of Ahsoka and her journey of coming into her own. When we first met Ahsoka, she was a reckless kid that Anakin took under his wing and helped form into a strong Jedi. When the character was first created in the beginning of the Clone Wars, she wasn't even liked by the community, but over the years of seeing her growth not only as a character, but how it affected Anakin and his story and how their relationship grew together, it makes her actions that much more meaningful. Even though Ahsoka was created years after The Revenge of the Sith was released, her story through the Clone Wars adds that depth into Anakin's character to why he distrusts the Jedi, and it helps to bridge that gap that we don't get to see in the movies of why he ultimately turns against them. Even though they may not directly talk about it in those movies, the story lines up so much with the prequels that it doesn't conflict with what we already know. With Galen Marek, it's similar as he was created well after the original trilogy, but what does he actually add to the character of Vader? There's not really much we see in The Force Unleashed that helps fill in gaps or adds emotional context to Vader as a character or the overall story. How does having a super powerful apprentice add onto the original trilogy? Galen Marek was placed to fill some of that middle that was not yet discovered, but because of the time it takes place in, there's really not a lot of room to add in a Vader apprentice while giving it the amount of time and effort it needs to really blossom. The story already had a lot of moving pieces at this point, and because of that, certain plot points ended up conflicting with what we already know to be true in the movies. One of the first things I think about is the idea that Vader and Palpatine are directly responsible for the creation of the Rebel Alliance because of the plan to draw out the individuals and unite them on purpose just so they could destroy them. And frankly, I think that's a bit ridiculous. It's one thing like in the original trilogy, and I believe it's the Return of the Jedi, where Palpatine wants to bring together the already established Rebel Alliance in one spot. That way they're an easy target, and he gives them a target that they can't ignore so that he can destroy them all at once. That's completely different to creating an organization from a bunch of people who might not become a threat in the future. Like, hey, here's a good idea. Let's all get together and actually overthrow the Empire. That seems kind of silly that Palpatine and Vader would want them to even have that chance to do that. And honestly, like if that was the original story and that's all we already had, then okay, it fits in the timeline and I can kind of live with that. But to change that perspective after we already have all the information, it makes them look kind of stupid, to be honest with you. For me, on launch, the first time I played it, I kind of ignored all this information, and I'm sure you did as well, because I was more focused on the power fantasy that this game creates. Because if I'm being honest, why would I not want to play as a super overpowered Sith? It does sound pretty cool on paper. Like I said earlier, that was the most substantial part of Galen Marek, and that's really the most memorable part, in my opinion, of playing The Force Unleashed. But that's just not enough to sustain my interest over time. Yes, he is very powerful, that's really cool. But it can't be at the cost of the integrity of the Star Wars universe. I didn't get to spend any time earning the powers or growing in the Force. Galen just had the powers from the beginning. And his powers are so strong compared to everyone around him that everything also just seems unimportant. I mean, he literally pulls a Star Destroyer from the sky. So now we look at Star Destroyers, and instead of them being these really giant, intimidating things, it's like, okay, one really strong Force user can just pull it down with ease. And unfortunately, the Star Destroyer is not the only part of the game that makes Galen Marek so strong. He's also so strong that he can go toe-to-toe with Vader, not once, but twice. And to make matters even worse, he is also able to defeat Sidious before deciding not to kill him. Now, as the character playing the game, I get it. It is fun. I don't want to lose a boss fight just because it's in the story. I get it. But it also makes everything more meaningless. We already know Vader and Sidious are not dying. We know we got 3 movies and a lot of other media that says they're alive. But even if I do know they are going to live, they should be really intimidating as I remember in these other movies. That is what I love about Jedi Fallen Order and what they did with Vader when he encounters Cal. Throughout the game, Cal meets Inquisitors, and for the most part, he's kind of able to keep his own on and off. But the second Vader comes into the scene, it's just game over. Like, you see the power behind Vader. Vader's throwing around people like ragdolls, almost disrespectful in a sense. But in The Force Unleashed, he doesn't really feel special. He feels like just another character. It's not climactic because Vader gets his butt kicked. Instead of being like, uh-oh, it's Darth Vader. It's more of like, okay, there's Vader. Now it's a boss fight. Let's beat him so we can keep moving on. To me, that kind of defeats the purpose. Now look, I do understand gameplay needs to be fun. Like I said previously, it's considered a power fantasy, which means in essence the character can do whatever they want. That was a key to the enjoyment inside of The Force Unleashed. That was in the development plans from the beginning. More than any other Star Wars project, it was meant to be a game that follows an absurdly powerful protagonist and allow the player to do things we haven't seen before. And while that may be fun to play, it can sometimes cross a line into boring or repetitive when the character is in almost no danger throughout the game because of their strength. It's a very fine line when a game has a character that is supposed to be that powerful. Now in gaming, we're in a time where these RPG leveling systems where if you're under leveled, it may take a bunch of hits just to take out a normal enemy because the game is telling me that's the case. So it is refreshing to see an older game that doesn't limit your character's power just to make the combat harder. But the problem is, the combat is unfortunately unpolished. So although in design it works and at times it is fun to play, it becomes lackluster in terms of overall satisfaction. After a few hours of playing the game, I'm not wanting to come back for more. I think of games like Spider-Man and the web swinging, or Assassin's Creed Unity and the parkour. Those are just a few systems where they were extremely satisfying. Even after a long time playing, you always found yourself wanting to go back and do more of that stuff. I never wanted to skip out on those type of mechanics. In The Force Unleashed, there were times where I felt like I was doing the combat just to kind of get to the end of the game. Spending too much time in combat, I kind of realized that when you're controlling the character, it's kind of clunky. You kind of get stuck on things, right? The lightsaber duels can become extremely repetitive the more you play, which is a little bit tough when you're talking about a game when you are playing a strong Sith. That shouldn't be the case. That should be the part of the game that excels the most. Unfortunately, like I previously stated, it's really an overtime problem, which is why my memory of the game is different the more I play it. The Force Unleashed is one of those games that I think less of the more I play it, which I know kind of sucks because it's like, from the outside perspective, it's not that bad. But then the more I play it, the more I pay attention to the story, it really doesn't grow on me like a game really should. And honestly, if you are someone that hasn't played it recently and you disagree with some of the sentiments that I've mentioned, I would actually really advise you to go back and give it another shot. I want to see how good you think it is now that you're thinking about the game in a different light, because when you go back and pay attention and see, did I really enjoy the gameplay? Do I really enjoy that story? Or was it just fun because from the outside perspective, it was fun to play as that character, right? There is no wrong answer. That's the beauty of games, because just because my opinion might be something, it doesn't mean that we all share that same sentiment. Whether or not you connect with Galen Marek as a character, or you just connect with the story, or do you just really like the gameplay, right? That's really different for everybody. The lens you play games in is completely different. That's why I say it's worse than I remember, because it's not necessarily about how bad or how good the game is, but how good is it compared to what my initial look was all those years ago. It was a really cool idea and it did leave some good memories, but it just lacked the execution, in my opinion, to make it a great game that can stand the test of time. That's why, honestly, I find it really interesting when people call for Galen Marek to make a return into the canon in a new way. Like, there would have to be a lot of changes towards the characters and the way the story was told to even allow it to fit into the timeline. But it does go to show how polarizing the character was, whether you enjoyed the game, whether maybe you just saw a friend play it, whether you've just seen some clips of it, or whatever the case is. All these years later, it's always a topic of conversation to bring Galen Marek into live action or into different games. Like, I know a lot of people wanted him to show up in the Cal Kestis Jedi series. There would obviously be a lot of changes, like I said, and the plot would have to be a little bit better written to make it fit correctly. But giving Galen Marek more screen time is not the worst idea if the plan is to bring more love to the character, because I do think even after all these years, there is a lot of love for The Force Unleashed, even though it may not hold up the same over time. I think that it wouldn't be bad to be able to redeem it in one way or another. I would be interested to see how that would look. So let me know what you guys think about The Force Unleashed down below, what you think about it, what you like, what you don't like. Do you agree with me? All the good stuff. And if it does stand the test of time. And if you did enjoy the video, drop a like. And as always, I will see you next time.